Hey buddy. In 1427, a group of Portuguese ships were exploring the Atlantic Ocean when they came across a series of small islands that we now call the Azores, 1,500 kilometers west of Portugal. The islands were settled by Portuguese and Flemish people over the next few decades, building villages and farms. If you had asked a historian 50 or 100 years ago who it was that discovered the Azores, they would have told you that it was the Portuguese in 1427. But today, we now know that that's not true. In 2021, a research team took core samples from lake sediment soil on some of the islands, and they found evidence of charcoal from fires and even signs of domesticated grazing animals like cattle and sheep, all dating back to about 700 or 850 AD. Someone, somehow, had settled the Azores something like 700 years before the Portuguese ever discovered them. A group of people were farming on the Azores centuries before the Portuguese even stepped foot on those islands. Naturally, there are people that are marveling at the fact that we're now rewriting history based on these new findings. But the truth is that we've always known that the Portuguese were not the first people to find the Azores. Hell, even the Portuguese always knew that they weren't the first people to find those islands. From day one. Because when those ships first found those islands in 1427 and they were searching around the shoreline of the volcanic island they now call Corvo, the island of the Crow, they discovered something really bizarre. Standing on the western cliff face of the island was a statue. A very old statue that was heavily eroded. And this wasn't just a statue of a man, it was a statue of a man sitting on a horse, extending his arm out into the Atlantic Ocean. So not only did the Portuguese discover right then and there that there were already people who had settled on those islands, but it was a civilization of people who had mastered horses and could make statues. The Portuguese understood right then and there that these new islands that they had just discovered were already once settled hundreds of years earlier by some sort of a mystery civilization. And to this day, we've never been able to properly explain who it was, how they knew these islands existed, and how they managed to get there.
It wasn't long before the mainlanders stripped Corvo of everything that it valued. They demanded that that statue be brought back to Lisbon. It was broken into pieces and shipped to an indifferent king, uncared for by a people with little desire to even admit it existed. After all, it was proof that they weren't first. It remained a curiosity of the court until it was lost and turned to legend. There are no pictures of it, no drawings, no representations of any type, no proof that it ever truly was here at all. Just a memory hidden in the fantasies of people on a volcano deep in the ocean.
So why did the Portuguese pretend that they were the first people to discover these islands in 1427? Even with that statue gone, there's still a lot of evidence on those islands that there used to be people there centuries before the Portuguese landed. The BBC did a piece about this a few years ago where they talked to locals who had theories about the structures that they've found. Several of the islands have leftover stonework and remnants of bizarre engineering designs that people have debated about for hundreds of years now. There are dolmens, caverns, and even a kind of rudimentary aqueduct setup. There's no consensus on these structures though. Experts argue that the stonework could have been done in the 15th century by the original Portuguese settlers, but several of the residents who currently live on those islands argue that a lot of that stonework has to be much older than that. They've found several materials and artifacts on the islands that have been tested. Some of the materials found in these caverns date back to about 2,000 years ago, but apparently some of the ceramics they've found date back to almost 4,500 years ago. This is unreal if these dates are true. There are also old stone anchors left on the shorelines that can't be dated, but their design is similar to the anchors that were used in 1000 and 2000 BC. I don't know that they're right about any of this, I just wanted to express that there are people who are throwing these kinds of theories around. Stuff like this, though, doesn't look traditionally 15th century if you ask me. But what do I know? I'm just some dummy with a YouTube channel. As for these more recent findings from the core samples taken in 2021, we still don't know for sure who it was that settled the Azores about 700 years before the Portuguese discovered the islands, or how that earlier group was even able to find the Azores in the first place. But we do have some ideas. The most interesting thing to talk about here is a medieval map from 1375 that shows a series of small islands in the Atlantic Ocean out west of Portugal and the Mediterranean Sea that we can infer are the Azores. 9 islands in 3 clusters. This map was created 52 years before the Azores were officially discovered by the Portuguese. This is part of the Catalan Atlas, created in 1375 using older maps and charts as sources. The problem is that we don't really know much about the sources for this atlas. What were these original charts and maps? It's clear that sailors knew about these islands well before this map was created in 1375. How much earlier? There's no way of knowing for sure. So who knew about these islands? How did they know about these islands? And how did we end up losing that knowledge? Those are all mysteries right now. I'm actually trying to put together a video about old maps because there are a lot of historical anomalies like this. I talked about the Piri Reis map in my California video, for example, which shows part of Antarctica in 1513, which is about 150 years before Antarctica was discovered. Again, this map was also compiled using older sources, which means someone knew about Antarctica even earlier than that. The rumor is that the Piri Reis map was created using information that had survived the Library of Alexandria. So is that how the Europeans knew about the Azores 50 years before the Portuguese landed there? Maybe. I wish that we could figure out the original sources for the Catalan Atlas. Either way, because we now know that people knew about these islands somewhere around 50 years before the Portuguese discovered them, that means that it's possible that people knew who it was that settled there something around 700 years before that. Or at very least, they might have had contact with the people who lived there. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of trade happening back then, because the people who live on the Azores today wouldn't be able to properly function without support from the mainland Portuguese. Life on these islands is hard, unrewarding, and isolated. The people there aren't fully self-sufficient. But the settlers who lived there in 700 AD might have been hardened people who were used to difficult lifestyles. If the original settlers were from a harsher environment, maybe the volcanic soil and moderate year-round temperature might have been a huge upgrade for them. The biggest clue that we have as to where the original settlers might have come from actually can be found in the animal life that was already there on the islands when the Portuguese landed. The research teams that tested the core samples also tested DNA of some of the rodents on those islands, and they found that some of the mice have DNA from northern European mice. And because of that, the research teams believe that it was probably the Scandinavians who ended up accidentally on the Azores when their ships were blown off course in 700 AD. But it's also possible that the Scandinavians already knew about those islands somehow and were intentionally keeping them a secret. For a Scandinavian who's used to shallow soil and long, harsh winters, these islands would look fertile and comfortable in comparison. And it's possible that nobody else knew that they existed, which would make them really safe from raids and attacks. Even if they did end up on these islands by accident, they might have chosen to stay because it was a mini utopia for them. There's no way of knowing for sure exactly how long these Scandinavian settlers stayed on these islands. It might have been decades, it might have been centuries, but it was long enough for them to bring domesticated animals to the islands like cattle, sheep, and even horses. And this makes a lot of sense because the Scandinavians, the Vikings, they had discovered a lot of different lands and islands long before any of the Europeans did. Famously, the Vikings even found North America hundreds of years before Columbus sailed the ocean in 1492. But if it was the Vikings, how did the Azores Islands end up on medieval maps? The problem is that the Vikings did not use maps. They never charted maps. The Vikings navigated entirely by memory, as well as using rudimentary measuring devices. That's how they found the British Isles, that's how they found Iceland. And another problem with the Scandinavian theory is that the Scandinavians were not famous for riding horses, or even for making complex statues for that matter. The vast majority of their movements was either by boats or on foot. And the vast majority of their statues were really more just poles that had human-like features carved into them. Yes, sometimes Vikings rode horses, and yes, sometimes Vikings are depicted as riding horses in statues, but the Vikings themselves didn't really make statues like this. Well, as far as we know. And they did not make a lot of art boasting about their horses in general. So it's possible that this statue was actually older than the Scandinavian settlers who landed there in 700 AD, or we're wrong about who it was that settled there in 700 AD. I think that it's possible that some of the European kings knew about the Azores well before the general public knew about them, and knowledge of these islands was intentionally kept a secret from the public until they decided to reveal them to everyone in 1427 when they had the technology to reliably travel there. Or maybe only one or two kingdoms knew about these islands, but didn't talk about them because they couldn't verify that they existed, or, you know, some reason. Or maybe even the Knights Templar knew about them, or the Catholics, or the Greeks. The Templars had one of the most powerful navies in the world at one point, and they had excessive knowledge of the seas because of that. And the Greeks have absorbed a lot of information from the ancient world from their travels and studies. There's lots of ancient history from around the world that we only know about today because the Greeks were able to record it. And the Greeks would have also have had access to the Library of Alexandria. And God only knows what kind of information was in there. Before the invention of the printing press, the average person didn't have access to that kind of information, and they certainly didn't have access to maps. And the average person would not have been taught the ins and outs of every single island and land that existed across the world. Only royalty, nobles, priests, and the scholarly class would have had access to information like that. A lot of information that educated people from that time would have taken for granted were not common knowledge. So maybe royalty and maybe even the scholarly class knew about the Azores long before the average person did, but they had just never disseminated that information to everybody else for some reason. And then maybe after a few generations of not talking about it and maybe a few scrolls disappearing, that information just became lost as everybody forgot about it. I mean, they aren't called the Dark Ages because of how tough life was back then. They're called the Dark Ages because a lot of information did not survive that time period. They're called the Dark Ages because we have so little information about what was actually going on back then. Any information or knowledge that the church deemed dangerous was burned or destroyed, and only a small amount of the information from that time period survived. So it's possible that even the Portuguese themselves knew about the Azores centuries before they discovered them, but they had somehow forgotten about the Azores because that information was lost throughout the Dark Ages. Maybe whoever it was that ordered those ships to explore that part of the Atlantic Ocean in 1427 knew that those islands should be there and merely sent the ships as a way to confirm their existence. And maybe the whole narrative about them discovering the islands was just a way that they could create a legal claim over those islands. I mean, if the Portuguese admitted that they already knew that those islands existed before they landed there in 1427, then they might have also had to admit how they knew that those islands were there and who the original settlers were. Maybe the fact that we don't know who was settled on those islands before the Portuguese landed there is the entire point. Maybe 15th century Portugal intentionally erased that information from history. Maybe they never wanted us to know. The problem with that theory, though, is that these medieval maps depicting the Azores Islands don't come from Portuguese sources. The location of these islands in this medieval map comes from Greek and Roman writers from the 1st and 5th centuries. Maybe the Portuguese really didn't know that these islands existed. Maybe the Portuguese were one of the few that didn't know that these existed. So if it really was Greek and Roman writers from the 1st and 5th centuries that told us about these islands first, then we have to ask, How did these Greek and Roman writers know about the islands? Well, there's a couple of theories for that. The first possible source, of course, could be from the Library of Alexandria. Again, people spread that exact same rumor about the Peri-Reis map, suggesting that it was sourced using information from charts and maps in the Library of Alexandria. Some people have suggested that the Greeks and Romans might have learned about the Azores from information that they gathered from the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians instead. Their civilizations date as far back as 1200 BC. These cultures were among the first in history to master the sea, and they both had extensive knowledge of the waters for their time. And there's plenty of information to suggest that both the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians had found a plethora of different lands well outside of the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, centuries or even millennia before any other civilization had discovered them or charted them on maps. So we have to ask the question, was the city of Atlantis as described by Plato in the Azores Islands? 12,000 years ago, during the time of Atlantis, the Azores would have been much larger. Back then, the global sea level was around 400 feet lower than it is today, so those islands would have been much higher above the water. The Azores Islands are mostly volcanic islands. They're sitting on top of 3 different fault lines in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe there were a series of different natural disasters that completely reshaped that region. There could have been massive earthquakes that tore the land up and dropped it below the sea level. There could have been massive volcanic eruptions that completely buried the region, and they could have been completely washed over with massive tsunamis. Or maybe the islands were just slowly lost as the sea level gradually rose over the centuries. Or maybe it was all of the above. The point is that that region is extremely unstable, and even though it appears stable now, it's very easy, because it's a volcanic region and those are volcanic islands, that landscape can drastically change over a very short period of time. I made a video about Atlantis a few months ago, and I had a lot of people asking me why I didn't mention the Azores as one of the possible locations for the city of Atlantis. These islands are pretty much exactly where Plato said that the city of Atlantis should be, right? Well, the Azores deserved this entire video to themselves because their history is so sketchy and unclear. But also because there aren't any clear signs that there were people living in the Azores thousands of years ago like there were with the other candidates that I mentioned in that video. I don't think that I could actually make a good argument that the Azores were the home to Atlantis. If Atlantis was here, the entire city should be completely submerged under the ocean by now. So the best that we can really do today is look at satellite imagery of the seafloor and make guesses about where we think that it might have been. The entire Azores plateau under the ocean is riddled with interesting features. There are people who believe that they found a pyramid under the ocean, and there are dozens of different areas that people think could have been the island of Atlantis. But also there are people who believe that the entire Azores plateau used to be lifted up higher above the seafloor. And when the seafloor rose up above the islands, the plateau itself also dropped down closer to the seafloor. Again, that entire region is completely unstable. There are 3 fault lines there. All of those islands are volcanic. Lots could have happened. So even if Atlantis was in the Azores, we might be completely mistaken as to what part of the Azores we should even be looking for it. All of that could have happened upwards of like 12,000 years ago, so who knows what's changed in that time? And who knows if any of the features of Atlantis are even visible anymore? The best we can do right now is guess. Maybe there were people there thousands of years ago. Maybe not. But for people who believe that the city of Atlantis was real, the Azores are the most popular candidate. What if the Scandinavians or the Northern Europeans who had settled on the island of Corvo in 700 AD knew about the Azores because they had somehow retained information about Atlantis? How did the Northern Europeans even discover the Azores in the first place in 700 AD? Did they just find them by accident? Is that what history really is? A series of accidental discoveries that are eventually forgotten until they're accidentally discovered again hundreds of years later? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think that the earlier settlers from 700 AD were the Scandinavians? Or were they some other group that we hadn't considered yet, like the Irish or something? Or do you think that those islands were settled thousands of years earlier like some of the locals have suggested? Or were the Azores the home to the city of Atlantis? Was knowledge of these islands simply forgotten because nobody had traveled there in hundreds of years? Or was the knowledge of these islands intentionally kept a secret for one reason or another? And what would that reason be? Thank you so much to my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. People who support my work get to watch my videos in advance, and you also get access to exclusive content. Patrons and Ko-fi members also get access to the Armoured Skeptic Discord server. Again, thank you so much. I love you guys.